I see us live.
All right.
Carlton? I see us streaming on Facebook.
You're ready to go on, Mo. You're on.
All right. Well, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. So the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race and Culture has been having conversations that are centered on race and racism. So this is another conversation. Today, the focus is Asian American Pacific Islanders or Asian Pacific Islander Desi Americans navigating anti-Blackness. And we felt it was important to have this conversation for several reasons, which we will talk about. But one reason was that our people in this kind of category are often absent from conversations about race and specifically anti-Blackness. And also, we don't always talk about racism within our own communities and anti-Blackness within our own communities. So we'd really like to use the opportunity today to explore anti-Blackness and our own racial socialization and our own journeys, and also our attempts to overcome this manifestation of white supremacy. So thank you again for joining us. And I think that we will pause for a minute just to see if others have anything to add before we introduce ourselves. Okay, so my name is Anmol Satyani, and I am an alumni of the ISPRC, and I identify as South Asian American, and more specifically Pakistani American. I'd like to ask others to introduce themselves. Will, could you begin?
Hi, good evening. My name is William Liu, and I identify as Chinese American and Asian American. And I'm currently a professor and department chair at the University of Maryland at College Park.
Cynthia?
Thanks. You'd think after months of Zooming, you would get that. Hi, everybody. My name is Cynthia Chen. I'm also an alum of the ISPRC in Boston College. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm currently in private practice and working part-time at a children's hospital.
Sam?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Wan, and I'm also a Boston College alumni and currently the staff psychologist, a staff psychologist and director of training for the fellowship program at the San Francisco VA.
I forgot to identify my ethnicity. I identify as Chinese and Taiwanese American, second generation, meaning my parents immigrated to the US, and as Asian American. Sorry.
And on the heels of that, I identify as Chinese American and Asian American.
Marsha?
Hi, I'm Marsha Liu. I am also Chinese American, second generation. My pronouns are she and her, and I have a private practice in New York City. I also work at college, working on an outreach program that focuses on the mental health of the Asian American Pacific Islander students there. I identify as Chinese American and Asian American Pacific Islander. Those are the words I usually use, but it's kind of fluid depending on where I am.
So, and also to mention, we have Carlton Green in the background, and he will be monitoring the feed and also letting us know what kind of comments or questions you may have. So please participate. We really want to hear from you. And I will be a kind of a pseudo moderator, but also a participant. We also wanted to just start off by acknowledging some limitations in terms of terminology, and specifically the AAPI and APIDA terminology. So I wonder if anyone would like to comment on that.
I'm gonna say there's so many ways that our community refers to itself, and I feel like there's so much history behind the names, and there's you know, the language is really political and it's really important, and I know we struggled as a group really trying to think of the best way to be really thoughtful in an inclusive way, but also seeks to highlight, or that we also bearing in mind that there probably is no perfect term that really that it encapsulates like these 50 ethnic groups that that are spanning this like aggregate.
Yeah, I think that was a conversation that we had, and that was partly why we chose to use both AAPI and APIDA, but also acknowledging that not everybody that fits under this category really identifies or resonates with either of these terms. So just want to acknowledge that as we start. And we also wanted to mention a limitation related to this particular panel as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as we can see, like the vast majority of us identify as East Asian and specifically Chinese American. I think it's really important to note, like, of those 50 ethnic groups, 50 and more, that there's a lot of marginalization within our community, that South Asian Americans, Southeast Asian Americans, Filipino Americans, Pacific Islanders, oftentimes their stories are really marginalized. And it's something that we also really were thinking about and wrestling with as we were putting this panel together, and wanting to acknowledge that as like a deep limitation, but also like this being maybe a start to this conversation that we're sharing with each other.
So that might be a good jumping off point in terms of talking about anti-Blackness. So when we're talking about this terminology, how do you all think that it is connected to anti-Blackness, white supremacy? What comes to mind?
For me, I think it's important to acknowledge and to keep working towards increased inclusivity, like being able to, foster more community, and at the same time, not letting that stop our work together, not letting that stop like us having this panel and speaking to this topic that's so relevant and so important, has been. But the time is now, I think, and I'm glad that we both can see and acknowledge the limitation, but still wanting to have this really important conversation together and sharing that with everybody who's here with us.
I think the struggle with trying to identify the appropriate terminology that captures so many diverse groups within the Asian American communities is a struggle between our ability to self-identify and self-articulate how we want to see ourselves, and it also confronts the larger racialization process that many communities of color are experiencing. And so we're constantly sort of fighting between how we want to see ourselves, how we identify ourselves, and then also trying to make meaning of ourselves within a larger white supremacist environment. And for many Asian Americans, I think the struggle that we have in terms of self-identifying is also a process of how we acculturate, how we identify with our own culture, how we start to see ourselves within the larger dominant society. And Asian Americans are constantly, I think, positioned in American society to be the model minority, right? And that positioning affords us some privileges, some power, but I would consider those kind of proxy power. It's a proxy privilege. It gives us a semblance of being accepted when we're really not. And so I think it's a constant struggle with how we want to identify ourselves within the larger society. But white supremacy is a part of our lives. Acculturation, for instance, for some Asian Americans means that we adopt and internalize anti-Black sentiments, anti-Black attitudes as a way to as a way to become closer to whiteness, in a sense, to accommodate whiteness, to seem more acceptable in the dominant society. And so we participate in anti-Blackness as a way to seem more American, unfortunately.
There was a lot in what you just said, and really meaningful. I wonder if we can move into, and I think this is related to what you're saying, is sort of why have this conversation? Why do we think it's important? And maybe everybody could kind of respond. Just also for you personally, why is this important?
If I could just say a few things. One is on a personal level, so this topic is a difficult one for me to really wrap sometimes a very clear way of thinking about it in my head. And so it's part of why I want to be a part of this discussion is really about using it as a way for me to develop my own thinking as I talk it out with other people who both might have similar experiences and or different experiences. So I think some of the value for me, at least, is to really help me, hopefully as I participate and that process helps others. I also think that we're talking about some challenges of our own labeling and self-identification, which probably feeds into the kind of a basic question of what about me when it comes to race and when it comes to inclusion and exclusion, which I think is a valid question, but also one that can really take away from attending to Blackness and understanding other folks, especially when it's a moment to really recognize Black lives. So I think at the bottom of it, it's a very valid question we all probably have at different points in our lives is, who am I, but also what about me in this society? But at the same time, that shouldn't also forever take us away from the discussion of what about Black people and what about their lives, and how is it that we need to focus on them and center them.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you both have shared. I feel like it's a conversation that I feel like the first time this year, it feels quite new that we're actually having this conversation more publicly. I've always felt like it was a missing voice in the discussion about anti-racism and the movement. I wondered how other Asian American Pacific Islanders felt in terms of our very complicated triangulation with Black folks, with our own internalized anti-Blackness, and what tools we can use when we're trying to confront. Like I notice myself either defensiveness or shame or all these different things that come up, and not really having a lot of space or modeling of like how to navigate that as an Asian American person. So I feel like it's so important for us to at least try and wrestle with it, as painful or as anxiety provoking as it can be. And it's also, yeah, it feels like we're trying to move through this with some intentionality.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge, like, you know, what you're all saying and echoing some of those same thought processes and feelings of defensiveness, and even, you know, now speaking to like, why is this important to me personally, and hearing everyone else's response, I feel those, you know, like bodily sensations of anxiety, and speaking this out loud and knowing that it's sort of counterculture, you know, goes against at least for me, like, you know, what I was taught by my family in terms of not talking about difficult things in public. And then also I think just the general US culture about not talking about race, period. And how there's this vulnerability that, you know, I appreciate from all of you and engaging in this conversation. And that if we don't have these conversations, how do we heal? How do we even begin the journey of healing or, you know, making some changes? And so that's why I really wanted to participate today.
Yeah, I was thinking about messages I've received about, you don't air your dirty laundry, like family, whether it's family, whether it's cultural, and you got to live up to this model minority myth, and therefore you don't talk about difficult things in public, like racism in your own community, and so yeah, I think it's incredibly important. I agree, Marcia. I don't think we've had enough conversations, and I think that we need them. We really need them. I really appreciate everybody's sharing.
It makes me think about how, like, why we've kind of, why we've distanced ourselves from those conversations as a community in the past. And I think speaking to the collectivistic, like the shame, like keep it inside the family, don't air the dirty laundry. And then I also think about the model minority myth, like don't disrupt, don't challenge our proximity to whiteness. I feel like I've heard other people like we have it okay, if we make too much of a fuss, what's going to happen to us? And really trying to push against that. I was thinking about this around like all the different terms we used to call each other, like to call our group. And I remember when like we used to be kind of just referred to as Asian American, and there was a push to be termed as Asian American Pacific Islander to highlight Pacific Islanders who haven't really had their voice heard. And I remember thinking like, oh, people aren't going to do this. We should like just accommodate to this most simplistic way to talk about us because then it's more palatable. And I can hear it, I can see it now, like that accommodating towards white supremacy, like just being like, make it easier. People don't have the attention span, which then of course marginalizes ourselves and then continues to kind of play into this game that we're not going to win anyway.
So I wonder if this is a good point to start to kind of unpack our own personal experiences with regard to anti-Blackness in our own experiences or socializations, and yeah, and really and I think just to follow up also about what is that like to talk about, and I'm glad to start, or glad may be the wrong word, but when I think about my socialization around anti-Blackness, the first thing that really comes to mind are the messages I received about skin color and colorism. Don't spend too much time outside in the sun. You're going to get dark. No one will marry you. I mean, that was a repeated message. And many other messages around that. The skin lightening creams, they're still popular in South Asia, but they were when I was growing up, and that they were talked about. A lot of conversations about other people, specifically women, but also men. No one's going to want to marry this person because, they're too dark, they've been in the sun too long, or whatever it might be. And so it's really hard to kind of talk about anti-Blackness without talking about that, because that is something I've explored a lot around, the impact of colonialism, of British colonialism over 200 years, and how that impacts people and their self-image, and the relationship to that and anti-Blackness. I mean, it's, to me, very much linked. And so then just building on that, the messages about Black people were really about, some of the just general stereotypes in the US about, being less intelligent, lazy, criminals, right? I mean, all of that. And it just, like, I have this knot in my stomach as I'm talking about it, because it disgusts me, honestly. But those were the messages that I received. And I also grew up in, a predominantly white area. But I also think my own community kind of reinforced some of these messages. So that's what comes to mind for me.
Thank you, Anmol. And yeah, my sharing is not very subtle whatsoever. In a lot of ways, growing up, I felt actually quite, in some ways, honored to be raised in the Bay Area of San Francisco. There is a lot of racial and ethnic diversity here. Doesn't mean, of course, that solves anything, but it also means that when you grow up here, there are ways that you, if you're lucky, you can intermingle with a number of different races. And but within my own, but of course, what I wanted to share was that in my own family, and I'm glad none of you know my parents, because I wouldn't really, this is the whole dirty laundry piece. What some of what I have a hard time sharing, even as I'm speaking, is sort of what I acknowledged as their attitude, their racist attitudes. You know, I grew up in a predominantly Latinx community in terms of where I went to school. And also my home is in a suburb, or my parents' home is in a suburb, which is actually quite ethnically diverse, racial and ethnically diverse as well. But when I had a Black friend from high school that I was quite close with, and brought him over, I learned from my mom at a later point that she really did not want him to come over, and it wasn't subtle whatsoever. And it was difficult for me, and it was something that I felt like I wanted to really counter with her, but I had a hard time with that. And I could say to myself, well, that's just her. On the other hand, you know, that's the family I grew up in. And I'm trying to think about ways that my own racist attitudes will come out at different times, and especially when I least expect it, which is probably when they really show what you're thinking instinctively at different times. So her, you know, her particular racist attitude was around my Black friend being a criminal, and or at least not him necessarily, but that there would be the potential that if I was his friend, that he might bring that into the home. It's very hard for me to talk about, very hard to bring up in a public forum like this, which I think is, I'm choosing to do that to be able to confront this. But that's some of my personal experience with it.
I'll jump in. I think one of the things that I grew up working class, very poor, and so the racially surrounded by quite a bit of diversity. However, I think as an immigrant to the U.S., I came over when I was 4, and when I was growing up, I was not subtly pushed towards acculturating to becoming more white in a sense. And so losing my ability to speak Chinese, trying to perfect my ability to speak English. And the way that the anti-Blackness piece comes out is a part of white supremacy, which is that as I started to struggle with trying to perfect all these things that would make me sort of innocuous as an Asian American person, I also had the tools then to use against other people of color, especially African Americans and Black. And so for instance, it would be, you know, if I was struggling and learning how to speak English, then I would start to use that as a tool against other people that I didn't think were speaking well. And so that's how the anti-Blackness came out. And I didn't really realize that until, you know, you start to understand how racism functions in your life, and you start to see, oh gosh, and I had the subset or the set of expectations around other people that were very white, very white, culturally normative. And these expectations were really detrimental in terms of my interactions with other people, you know, and so I wanted to only surround myself with other people that sounded like me, that dressed like me as I started to become more middle class. And unfortunately, what happens is that you start to racially isolate yourself, right? And because you don't look for other people of color, you look for other white people to be closer to. And so the anti-Blackness comes out in all of those different ways. And for me, it certainly was, for instance, as a way to discriminate based on language. What I was hearing didn't sound right, so I use that as a tool of anti-Blackness in my life.
That deeply resonates with me in terms of the foreignness. I think growing up, I grew up in Maryland in a suburb. It was a planned community, so it was very racially diverse, but not a lot of Asians. My elementary school was majority Black and white. I felt really comfortable with these other kids of color. But once I started middle and high school, I think I became a lot more self-conscious about the fact that my parents were immigrants. And this sense that they were just so foreign. They spoke with accents, people made fun of accents at school, and feeling just like this real hurt that I wasn't really considered American in the way that these other kids were, white or Black. And I was reflecting on this as we were preparing for this, and I was thinking, it was during those years that I noticed shifting, like really choosing to approximate myself with whiteness, because there could be a way that maybe at first I was thinking, if I'm invisible, then people won't see me and mock the fact that I'm Chinese. That's the first thing. But maybe I could be visible if I kind of erase that part of me and just kind of hang out with white people, and maybe I could by proxy get some power. Feel like I had friends that were cool and friends that I trusted, and in doing so, there was like a very subtle choice that's conscious and both unconscious of saying I'm not gonna be friends with those brown and Black people, because I know that there's sort of a cost. What will I get out of it in terms of like this social capital? Of course, this is not how like my 12-year-old mind is thinking, but like this is kind of how I remember kind of navigating. Oh, I just became friends with these people, and then when I was reflecting on high school as well, I was remembering that I remember feeling a lot of jealousy at times about the Black kids at my school. And I was trying to locate like where that is coming from. And I think a lot of it was just this real, very two-dimensional idea I had of them as this like cool kids that like everybody seemed to like, but also people feared. And that's part of what's happening, like the anti-Blackness that's so degrading. That I felt like they were powerful. And I felt so, like disempowered, not really knowing there seemed to be such an absence of Asianness in my life. And then when I think about like my 20s, I again had more friends of color, but then I also noticed I had more Black friends, but then I also noticed I really started to use like Black slang. I started listening to hip hop. I loved hip hop. I loved talking about it. And this feels like a very kind of typical East Asian thing of like trying to use Blackness as a proxy, that it trades you in your foreignness for being more American without really having any cost to you. Not the costs that obviously Black people endure every day. So it's something that has been like really complicated as I think about, how the spaces that I occupy and the way that I represent myself and all that. It feels like a little intellectualized now that I'm saying it. But I think there's a lot of shame around it, like my own sense of embarrassment that this is the way that I would imagine an entire group of people and people that I love, that feels like really, there is like this disgust on all of like acknowledging that as part of my history, and also something that I notice flare up in me now, just as Sam said, as it comes up now and having these reactions.
Thanks, Marcia. Like I really, resonate with everyone's sharing so far, and really thinking about that like sort of positionality that we're stuck, like that we feel like we've been put into as the model minority, and even, reflecting back on how Anmal started us off with how colorism is intertwined with anti-Blackness, and thinking about, how colorism is part of how I've connected with my Black friends, right? Like, I remember one of my dear friends like sharing with me just even about the saying, is it the darker the berry, the sweeter the juice? And her having to like explain that that saying to me, and then remembering my mom not really letting me to go out to play between the hours of like 11 to 5, which I'm pretty sure are just the hours that people play in the summer, because she didn't want me to be too dark. And when I asked her about it, it's like, well, because you don't want people to think you're a field worker. And then nosy, irreverent me was like, what's wrong with that? And it's like, well, because then that means you're not educated, right? And so like sharing some of those, that like the thought of the colorism or the anti-Blackness behind that, but then also what my mom is messaging to me by sharing that information with me, and how like it's always felt like sort of being stuck between trying to be white and then also trying to be a person of color, and figuring out, our own identities.
Thank you all for responding to that. I think a few of you mentioned kind of this proximity to whiteness or wanting to be closer. And I'm curious, sort of, how do we think that we benefited from anti-Blackness, from this proximity to whiteness or desire to be? What benefits have there been?
I can go. I mean, and I think there's some intersectionality of having attended a private Catholic school for elementary school. And I remember, I think it's this mix of being both a woman and model minority, but like, I wasn't the one who would get in trouble if there was, disruption in class. And it would always be either another, boy of color or whoever was actually sitting next to me. And other benefits too, right? Like just assigned prescripted like intelligence, and this assumption of being a hard worker, of being somebody who will go along or be, easy to get along with, and feeling more accepted that way.
So when I refer to proximity to whiteness, I'm also talking about proximity to white people. And what I'm also referring to is this idea that anti-Blackness, participating in anti-Blackness, and also our ability to subscribe to white supremacy allows us to physically be closer to white people. And most white people are still the centers of power. They still are the leaders of most institutions. And so our ability to parrot white supremacy, to participate in anti-Blackness, allows us to physically be in white spaces and allows us to persist in those white spaces. Being in those white spaces is, as Cynthia was talking about, gives us these kinds of privileges. And I call these privileges proxy privileges because they're not ours. We can't earn privilege. We can't earn racial privileges. Racial privileges are just there, right? So what we do is we earn our role and our position in white spaces, and our ability to participate in anti-Blackness, subscribe to white supremacy, allows us these kinds of proxy privileges. And those proxy privileges are positionality, their power, their specific roles. There's also material benefits. We also get raises, we get all sorts of things as a result of it. So there's huge structural institutional incentives built in to participating in anti-Blackness. And for people of color, for Asian Americans, for some of us, we've participated in it. We've become sort of these very innocuous people of color. We end up being in these spaces really close to white people where we interpret racism for them, or we take care of their feelings, as Janet has talked about as well, right? We console white people. So we become very adept at learning how to maintain our positionality in these white spaces, these institutions. So proximity to whiteness is literally not just an abstract idea, is literally a physical presence in white space.
Yeah, and I think of a couple of things that really matter in our world, which is relative safety. A lot of the invisible backpack statements are really about safety in whatever spaces you traffic in and live in, both physical safety and emotional safety, as well as relative abundance or relative provision of resources, and being able to have more, essentially, and have access to more, and also not be systematically excluded from that potential. So in my life, I've had access to educational opportunities, relative safety, physically and emotionally. As you said, Will, access to being around white people with relative ease and comfort, with relative acceptability. And also, I would not consider myself with a lot of wealth whatsoever, but relatively it is more, generally speaking. And acknowledging that is important as far as the piece of proximity to whiteness and white, the complicitness with white supremacy.
I would add that with the proximity to whiteness, I'm thinking about the model minority myth itself, and it's hard for me to say this because I feel like a little defensive, but I know that in some way, it had to help my self-esteem in some way. Just the assumption that I was a hard worker, the assumption that I was smart or at least good at math. I feel like most of my life I'm preaching about how degrading it is and how actually it's leaving so much of our communities out who have actually like high needs, and it really masks so many things. But I also can't deny that if teachers think you're smart, that's just going to help you with your relationship with them throughout your growing up. That has to have impacted my self-esteem throughout, just thinking that I'm capable. Probably not in certain areas, probably math and science especially, but maybe not as a dancer or as an athlete or other things, as a writer. But that's one thing I've been thinking about. And then I think absolutely access to people. I mean, that we are seen as safe. And so many white people will come to us asking for understanding about race, even, that we kind of serve as the safest proxy to confront their own anti-Blackness. And yeah, I'm just aware of that, being that person a lot for a lot of white friends of mine or white peers of mine. And then not really having any cost. That doesn't cost, I mean, that costs me some annoyance, but it doesn't cost me in the same way as if I was a Black person. And then in the smallest ways, I mean, the more insidious microaggressive ways, like nobody's following me in a store, afraid that I'm going to steal something. When I'm walking behind somebody, I'm assuming most people aren't thinking maybe this person is going to attack them. These are just things that I can go through, and I'm certainly not going to get followed by an Asian American person, which I know is a particular issue for Black folks who are shopping within stores that are run by Asian Americans. So whether it's institutional, whether it's individual, there's a lot of it everywhere that we really benefit.
As you all were talking, I was reminded of a question, I think that was posed in a previous Facebook live discussion between Dr. Helms and Dr. Jernigan Noesi. I think the person they were a person of color, not Black, and they were saying that white colleagues were approaching them, asking about, how to be a good ally to Black folks. I think hopefully I'm getting that right. It was along those lines. And it's really tied to this, I think, proximity to whiteness. And I remember my reaction to it was, wow, that feels really familiar to me. And I mean, often my response is, why aren't you talking to our Black colleague? Why is this question coming to me? And I think that that's related to this idea of, in fact, I think I asked at one point and someone said, well, you're easier to talk to, right? You're more comfortable, you're safer to talk to than, our Black colleagues. So that right there seems to be, I feel like it's a very common experience for me and very much an example of anti-Blackness that occurs, for me anyway, pretty frequently in many workplaces I've been in at this point. I'm curious too, and I think some people have talked about this a little bit, but I know that I think about some of the kind of knee-jerk reactions, ways that I'm complicit in anti-Blackness. And, I think one of them is, for me anyway, around like, looking over my shoulder if I'm walking alone at night, if there's a Black person behind me. It's so sort of deep, it's so instinctual. And yes, I could argue it's, some of it may be because I'm a woman, but I don't think that's not all of it, right? And I can think of a lot of examples like that, it's like, something I continue to work on, but these examples are still there. These experiences are still there. So I'm just curious if others have those kinds of experiences, those kind of knee-jerk reactions where you're like, oh, there it is again.
I can go. I think even as, the last few years as the acronym Black, Indigenous, and people of color became more popular and sort of replacing the more general POC or people of color acronym. I remember having this like instantaneous response of like, we're not, like, of feeling othered again and feeling left out and really having to sit with that about, like acknowledging that I'm centering myself and during this time when it's not about me or not just about me. And other things, like I think there's a lot of helpful graphics going around that, trying to explain Black Lives Matters and using sort of like a depiction of different shades, skin tones of like, fist raised and like what it means, what it doesn't mean, and having a definite defensive reaction to our proximity to whiteness, right? And wanting to belong, wanting to feel like a good person really is what it boils down to. And again, having that dichotomy of feeling sort of stuck in the middle between having the benefit of the proximity to whiteness and then also wanting to feel like a good person and one with the cause.
There is a question that that has come up on the feed that I wanted to pose. Question is, what makes us safer for white people? Is this creating an expectation for Asians to be uninvolved in political conversations?
I mean, I feel like it's related to the model minority stuff, right? Like we're seen as people that won't rock the boat. We're the minority that won't claim to be a minority. We'll just keep our mouths shut and do what the white people want us to do. Will, I feel like I might have cut you off. Yeah.
No, I agree with you. I think the model minority has a lot to do with it. I think for many Asian Americans, it's the internalization and identification with the model minority. I think for some of us, we grew up in communities and families where participating in anti-Blackness was very normative and very much expected, while simultaneously learning about anti-Asian racism, right? So you can do both. They're not necessarily the same thing. You you can be very well versed in anti-Asian racism and still participate in anti-Blackness. It's not not apart from each other. The other piece too, I think, is for many of us who are psychologists and counseling psychology and other psychology related fields in education, we learn our histories in very isolated ways, and so it's not very complementary, and we don't really understand the threads that connect all of us together. So that's a long way of saying that I think we find ourselves as a very acceptable, very innocuous racial group or racial person in many of these white spaces. We in some ways, because we want to see ourselves as being successful and getting ahead, we play into it. We become very successful in it. And, you know, that's our complicity, I think, as Sam was saying before. We are very complicit because we see upward mobility is very important to us. It reflects on our family and our cultural values to be very successful monetarily, but also in positions. And we're not very well versed in talking about anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism is a specific kind of white supremacist anti-racism. There's anti-Black racism and there's racism, right? So there's all these different forms, but we really need to talk about that and the genocide of indigenous peoples, you know, is separate in some ways, right? But they're all connected in that way. And I think those are really important crucial aspects of how we want to understand ourselves as racialized people in the United States. You know, our entry into the United States was predicated on those two pieces. And we have to understand ourselves as racialized people as an aspect of that.
Yeah, and it's hard to, I think, even in this hour, wanting to really be personal about it and not over intellectualize myself, you know, for me to not over intellectualize kind of what I believe and know about the monolithic group of Asian Americans, which we know is not accurate. And so, you know, at some level, my intellect says, you know, we are relatively, I'm just throwing out a word that comes to mind, it's not accurate, but sort of a relatively culturally self-absorbed, that we're sort of thinking about ourselves, generally speaking, what we can do for each other in our collectivistic way, which has its positive. On the other hand, it takes us out of sometimes the racial justice across the board, especially with Black people, where it's not our fight, or we don't think of it as our fight. We think of it as a self-preservation piece. You know, we have our own battles to fight with our own anti-Asian struggles. But I think that when we're talking about anti-Blackness, it also serves to exclude ourselves from having to be involved in those discussions and those injustices.
Yeah, we definitely benefit from not participating. I mean, I think that I think what we're trying to reconcile with is we also lose by not participating, that we're destroying something that in ourselves, like the fight for racial justice is like, we're all in this same fight together, or at least I know we're impacted differently. We are all trying to fight white supremacy. On your question about the knee-jerk reactions, I was thinking about one thing I was noticing was like, sometimes when I'm like, it's really late, I've worked whatever hours, I get on the subway, and there are a bunch of like loud Black teenagers. And my thought is first like, oh, it's like annoying, but whatever. But then I go to a really obnoxious respectability politics thing of like, you're gonna piss like all these white people off that are on the train, and then they're gonna judge you. And somebody needs to teach you not to do that on this train, otherwise you're gonna be treated in this really crappy way. And it's like really insidious because it looks like, oh, I'm just trying to protect you, when it's actually like just patronizing, and they're just being teenagers. And I was a very loud teenager. So just noticing, you know, all these ways that it's baked in and that just comes up, and even you can explain it to yourself with all of your defensiveness of being a good person. It's really unsettling to be with. there's another thought I had about the proxy. Yeah, I don't know. That's something, yeah, it's an ugly thought to admit to.
Yeah, it's hard to really recognize that you're having those thoughts and feelings in those moments. Sam, I was thinking about something you were saying too about just like we have our own things to worry about. Why do we need to be in this, right? Why are we in this fight? And it just reminded me of this realization that took a while actually to have, but this idea that this is connected to us. And for me, one way was realizing that the civil rights movement led to the Immigration Act of 1965, which is what allowed my parents to immigrate here. You know, and so we wouldn't be here without that. And just the idea that my personal feeling of like, I owe a debt of gratitude for that because my family's better off in this country, frankly. So just making those connections, you know, what is the connection to ourselves? And there are many, that's just one. But I remember just thinking like, wow, this is something I really need to acknowledge and recognize.
I feel like to both Will and Sam and Cynthia's points before, like I remember some different, like when we were in the early stages of COVID, there was a lot of talk about xenophobic stuff that was happening to East Asians. And I remember feeling like, oh, this is good. We're actually talking about this. And then as happens, many Black people were murdered by the police. And that conversation, it felt like, oh, we can't have two conversations at once. There's only room to have one conversation. And this sense of like, it's such a fallacy. We are all like trying to, it's the same thing, you know? And this competitiveness of like how we're triangulated is just so insidious, you know?
You know, I think part of the surprise for some Asian Americans in our communities when COVID was starting and the anti-Asian violence was happening was watching that those racial privileges that they thought that they had get pulled away, you know. And so, you know, that's why I keep referring to them as proxy privileges, because they can be taken away. They're contingent. They're not related to anything other than, you know, at this time you get some of these things, you get some protections, but you know, when it serves us serves the larger white community, we'll take those things away. There are no protections. And so in that way, you know, the conversation does shift, or did also start to shift towards Black Lives Matter. But, you know, that conversation was, as we all know, was always there. And I think it was a good challenge for a lot of Asian Americans, because I think it had us, what we needed to start to understand was that if we wanted to see our liberation or our freedom or have racial justice, that idea of racial justice has to start with Black racial justice, right? Because we can't have it until we understand the significance, the embeddedness of anti-Black racism in our society, and our collective well-beings go through that.
So I'm getting a question here too about whether we can talk a little bit about anti-Blackness in our own families, our communities, with siblings or cousins of the same generation. So not just about parents or grandparents, but same generation. And, you know, how those conversations are, how do they go for you?
These are challenging. I think we a lot of times in like kind of really focus on like our elders, and they're the ones that need to change. And I'm grateful for this question, because we know that there are very racist, anti-Black Asian American kids, like high schoolers, college students, young people. In my family, I would say that in conversations I've had where I'm really challenging people of my generation, I noticed getting really heated and defensive. I start a lot of times laying out some kind of TED talk for them about like, look at all these different pieces of evidence that show, and I think a lot of times what I've learned is like they're in a space that's very much about the anti-Asian racism. And it's so distracting them and they haven't extended towards like how the model minority myth is really used as an anti-Blackness tool, like how we've been used in this way. Can't really make that jump, but trying to return to that in the smallest ways, always, whenever it comes up of like, actually, I think I disagree. Like just, these are my thoughts, in a casual way that it's like, that it's knowing that this is a very long journey. I'm not going to convince that anti-Blackness has been fomenting inside of all of us for so many years, and trying to make challenging them like a new regular part of our conversation, of our discourse, or of our relationship, has helped me at least feel a little bit like, okay, this one didn't go well and we'll be back at it the next time we hang out.
This is where, for me, sorry, Sam, were you going to say something?
Oh, well, I was just going to say that maybe as a disclosure at some level that, this does not represent generally, of course, speaking from my own experience, the conversation doesn't happen very often with other Asian Americans that I am close with or our loved ones. And I think it's similar to what you were saying, Marcia, that, a lot of times anti-racism focuses on our own issues and our own concerns. And it's a gap between thinking about ourselves as well as then extending that to Black Lives Matter or Black issues. So, and that in itself, I think, is just a demonstration of a level of anti-Blackness that I have to own at some level. As you were saying, Marcia, that we need to work at bridging that, that it's not just about us, even though we do have valid concerns and questions and experiences to really work at. The conversation is larger, and it isn't just one or the other. So that's what I wanted to share.
I literally just had that conversation on Saturday with a family member about why racism still happens. And this is going to be an ongoing conversation, because where we started was talking about the Declaration of Independence, and we only got through that. So it's a long, extensive conversation that does involve how we talk about ourselves, how we understand our own racism. That's what we're doing right now, which is really very lovely. And then it's also understanding all these other different aspects that help us understand the extensiveness, the how white supremacy and anti-Black ideas and ideology infiltrate almost everything that we do. And it is overwhelming. And so for those of us who want to take on that responsibility and have the energy for it, I think it's, having all of these conversations all the time. And it's exhausting. So I'm not saying it's easy, but that's the responsibility that we have, I think, to be able to do that.
I was going to say something similar, just that it is exhausting. It's a struggle. And I think just trying to do this in small pieces over time is kind of the way I've thought of. I mean, I think Dr. Helm's theory, racial identity theory, people of color in particular, is very useful in terms of assessing what schemas, what lenses are people using, and then managing my own expectations around that. And then just, as you're saying, both of you, just coming back to it. But it's hard.
I want to just acknowledge that, you know, I think we advertised this conversation as an hour and we're going just past that, and letting the folks who are watching know that these are being recorded. And so if you only planned for an hour and you need to, you know, head out, you can always come back and watch the rest of our conversation when you have more time. But I think like, the prompt being how we're having these conversations with our generation. And I'm sort of embarrassed to think about, like, I have not thought about that, like explicitly thought about how I have those conversations with either my cousins or within my family. Like certainly I've had these conversations to some extent with Marcia and some other Asian American colleagues, but like not necessarily within my family. And I think that there's some self-reflection that I have to do there. And let me correct that. I've had some conversations with my parents and I'm sort of befuddled on how come it's so much why I can recall conversations with my parents and not so much with my brother. And I'm sitting here in an intellectual space thinking, is that because when my parents say something or do something, it feels much more like overt and explicit, whereas probably what's being reflected to me in conversation or interactions with my brother are the internalized messages that I'm carrying around too, and are harder for me to recognize and discuss with him, right? And so I really appreciate that question, and we'll continue to think about that.
Here's a question that has come up from the chat. Somebody wants to know, and it's a combination of questions that I think could be put together. What does a healthy AAPI identity look like? Does it look like a healthy white identity? And what does a decolonized APIDA community look like?
Can you repeat that second part, Carlton?
Sure. The question is, what does a decolonized APIDA community look like?
The healthy, oh, I'm sorry, Sam, you go.
No, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay, my first thought is like a healthy Asian American identity has to involve like eradicating the white supremacy of ourselves, but knowing that the white supremacy that's formulated our identity as Asian Americans, you know, the model minority stuff, the perpetual foreigner stuff, the anti-brown Asians, Islamophobia stuff, all the things. But knowing that it's immediately, you cannot talk about that without understanding fully the history of anti-Blackness and how we've been, our identity is founded upon anti-Blackness. So it's like, my idea is like, it has to have both parts. And I think like my own, like coming into my own Asian American identity has helped me understand anti-Blackness more, because it's so linked, and I can locate so many events that have happened in my life that I'm like, this is how it's all related.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know that I have an answer or response. It feels like an unanswerable question in the sense of, and I have a reaction to, is a healthy Asian identity more like a white identity, only in the sense that I have internalized, partly through my education and socialization at BC, that really our own identity is more so about our own recognition of where we are and who we are in the world. Now, of course, the reference points are important, and that's a lot of what we're also talking about. Now, we can't disentangle the reference points as well. But on the other hand, I also do think about how this is just a fluid thing without any one moment in time being the destination of it, that you arrive at some level of static identity around it. I think the question probably is alluding to potentially how how much closer is it to a white racial identity versus another kind of racial identity? And I don't think I'm there yet. I don't think I am there to accept that that would be what I accept. I think it's much more about who, still centering kind of in terms of my own racial identity, what it means for me to be Asian or Chinese American, and knowing these reference points and how that all fits together. But there's no one way I feel like that can be fully defined at any one point in time.
Yeah, this is a tough question. Our audience is asking lots of really thought-provoking questions. I'm here for it, except I don't have any answers. It made me think about one of the diversity challenges at BC while I was a student, and Thomas Parham was one of our guest speakers, and we were celebrating some certain anniversary of the racial identity model by Dr. Helms. Marsh, do you remember this? In the right, so but he gets up there, and and I'm wanting to listen to this influential man, and he starts talking about how let's not forget that the racial identity development model, all of them, are based in the assumption and that of racism and racial trauma. And so I'm really struggling with, like, how do we do, like, I don't know that any of us knows what like healthy racial identity development really looks like, because we've all been socialized in this white supremacist, anti-Blackness like society. And so, there's my struggle with, like, is a healthier racial identity look more like a white racial identity because they experience less racism? Maybe because of the experience less racism, but they're still also steeped in the whole ideas and values and beliefs behind white supremacy. So there's the part of me that sort of rejects that. But my answer is I don't know.
So I think one of the things that we want to try to understand too is that when we talk about anti-Black racism and racism as well, is that we also have to talk about anti-Black racism and racism well beyond just individual prejudices, discrimination, hatred, and start to reconcile with this idea that racism really is about the eventual death of a person of color and the eventual eradication of a community of color. Racism has no other function other than either the immediate or the slow drawn out death, right? High mortality rates, all those things, police related deaths, traffic related, all those things are a function of racism. Anti-Black racism in particular has a particular end, which is the death of Black people. Anti-Brown racism has the ultimate end, which is the death of brown people, and so on and so forth. So so one of the things that we have to move beyond is, in some ways, this idea that it's just hatred and we can get rid of this sort of prejudice. It really is this ingrained institutional notion. So a healthy sense of oneself means that it can only happen through the eradication of white supremacy. And we can't envision that because we can't envision what a society looks like where we eradicate white supremacy, because it's just everywhere, right? And it's global as well. So I don't want to present it in such a way that it's impossible to overcome, but that is the challenge that we have for myself. Is probably, I know it's likely very much the challenge that I'm going to pass down to my daughter, and probably so on and so forth. This is going to be an intergenerational fight that's not going to stop here, because it's not about hate. It's about the institutional eradication of people of color, which is what anti-Black racism is and what racism has as a function. So I don't know what that healthy identity looks like, but sort of reconciling, coming to this understanding that I am not going to participate in this genocide is a place to start. So, you know, we are in a time where that is still occurring. It just happens in a different way in some ways. So
Thank you all for responding to that very challenging question. So we have another question here that kind of ties in with how we wanted to wrap up. So the question is, what are some of the actions APIDA communities and others can perform to counteract anti-Blackness? And the question we wanted to wrap up is very much related about what are some examples we've seen or participated in of collaborative resistance against anti-Blackness. So what examples have we seen? And I think people are wanting to know, what can we do? I guess I can start off. One thing that I've been struck by recently, just a few examples that have come to mind after George Floyd's murder. There was, during one of the protests, there was an Indian restaurant owner's restaurant was, I think, burned down or something, or destroyed. And the reaction was not about, you know, kind of an anti-protester response or an anti-Black response. The response was much more, you know, I'll just rebuild my restaurant. This is more important, you know. And there have been several examples of that. I mean, not highlighted really in the news, but several examples of that. And so I've been really kind of inspired by that. And I think also just, you know, reading or learning more about Grace Lee Boggs, just as one example of somebody who really was involved in this collaborative resistance against anti-Blackness. And that was kind of at the center of her life. So I think that when we look around, we do see collaboration. It's just not always kind of on the headlines or highlighted very much. We have to look for it a little bit more, but I think it's there. And I think just us even having this panel discussion, this conversation tonight is also an example of this. So I'll just start off there.
Makes me think, I'm thinking about Grace Lee Boggs, and I'm thinking about the organizers in the 60s, and I'm thinking about Yuri Kochiyama and the Delano Manongs, and like there's a history of Asian American Black liberation resistance. And like that's part of our history. It's what it is to be Asian American. I think that I know I learned so little. If I didn't learn any of that on my own, you know, from school. It's had to take me really searching that out. But I think the models are there. I was thinking also about the beginning of COVID and seeing a lot of Black voices come out and say like the xenophobia is unacceptable against these East Asians. And then also seeing a lot of Asian Americans participate in the protests after George Floyd was murdered and continue to be part of this resistance. And I think that the idea that we can be in this together and we can, and specifically that Asian Americans can fight anti-Blackness on the front line, I think is really important.
Most of my, oh, sorry, Cynthia. I'll be brief. Most of my, well, in theory, half of my time is as a clinician, half of my time is as an administrator of a program. But in my clinical service, something I've been really working on in the last couple of years is a race-based stress and trauma group, along with several other people in the VA. And we're trying to really bring that type of focus to the VA, which typically has not had that type of focus for many decades. Trauma, of course, PTSD is something that's bread and butter for the military veteran population in terms of diagnoses and what's worked on and treated at the VA. But when it comes to race-based stress and trauma, it is something that Black veterans in particular have not had a voice with. And so one of the ways that I've been working at this at a systematic level is to really bring out that ability for that voice to be heard. And one of those clinical ways is to create these groups that we're running and be advocates for them nationally. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is always vacillating between what we can do as individuals for our own lives, our own internal world, as well as our nuclear worlds, but also kind of systematically, in some ways more importantly, and what we can do to address ways that people's voices are systematically not included, or presence, actual presence, as you were saying, Will, in fact, kind of the awful opposite of it, which is death. So, yeah.
Yeah, actually, Sam, that was really similar with my thoughts, and in terms of thinking about like both like individually and where do I have spheres of power, right, or influence, and you know, even though I'm not still on the Denver campus at my previous institution, I still have relationships with quite a few folks on the leadership team, and being able to both like balance using my voice and my relationships with those folks to highlight some of the needs and areas of consideration for them, and then also to encourage them, like, you know, if there's an individual interaction where I'm the safe person to come to talk about race, and having them reflect on like, why am I the safe one, right? Like what's going on here that you're feeling unable to have that individual conversation with your Black colleague.
I think for me, as in an academic space, one of the things that we can work together on is this notion of epistemic exclusion that happens with Black and Brown and Indigenous and Asian writers and researchers. What I mean by that is that one of the things that we can do is elevate the writings and the research of Black and Brown researchers, and really to look at our papers and the things that we write and publish, and intentionally cite Black and Brown authors in our papers. I think that's really important. And what you start to see is that the ideas and the research that we start to participate, that we come up with, starts to take a different form, because the authors that we're citing come to those questions around race and racism much differently than white researchers do. And so other Black researchers have already talked about this, which is this idea of epistemic exclusion, that we often cite the same people over and over again. And that becomes a sort of recuperation of white supremacist worldviews, even within our research, even in research that we want to use that's anti-racist. So I think one of the things that we can do is elevate Black and Brown writers in our own spheres. I think that's going to be really critical for us to be able to do that.
It reminds me too, Marcia, of what you were saying about knowing our own history. So us also reading the Black and Brown authors who are doing that work, and understanding better the collaboration that has already occurred between Black and Brown folks in this movement. Carlton, are there any other questions or comments at this point? I'm realizing we're almost at 90 minutes.
Yeah, I think you all have answered most of everything that's here. I think that the question about readings, I just put into the chat function for people to offer suggested readings to people for those who are looking for additional resources.
Great. Well, thank you all for participating, panelists. Thank you for Carlton for your work, and thank you everyone for listening and watching. We really appreciate it. And also to say that there is a lot of information right now on the ISPRC website, other dialogues like this, as well as other activities that people associated with the Institute are involved with. And a reminder that Diversity Challenge 2020 is approaching. It'll be October 23rd and 24th. It's a virtual conference this year. And this is the 20th anniversary of the ISPRC and the challenge. We are very excited about that. The theme is Goodbye Isms, Hello Future. So we hope you all will join us for that. Thank you all, and hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste.